Let's talk about ice baths. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. For those of you who are new here, I am a published health researcher specializing in muscle health. Today, we're going to look at this study that answers the question, are ice baths good for your gains? So the reason why this is important that this research was done was because we already know that being immersed in cold water for a long period of time isn't great for the mechanisms in our body that help us to build muscle. So generally speaking, if we dunk people in cold water right after they've resistance trained, the normal muscle protein synthesis spike that we see after we train is reduced in people for about 5 hours. Some people say it might even be longer and last a couple of days, especially if we're doing repeated bouts of cold water immersion. In steps Brad Schoenfeld and his colleagues. So this study was done out of his lab by someone called Alec Pinero. Essentially what they were trying to do was look at all of the studies that have been done on cold water immersion and the effect that it has on muscle growth, and try and come up with some sort of conclusion from the research that we have. Now, this type of research is called a meta-analysis, and it's pretty much considered the gold standard of scientific evidence that we have. Whereas one study might tell us one thing and another study might tell us another, when we do a meta-analysis, we look at all of the studies on a certain topic, and that will give us an idea of what the truth is, essentially. So what these guys did was they looked at studies that compared weight training with cold water versus weight training plus some other kind of recovery strategy, which was usually something like just static stretching. Now, in pretty much all of the studies that they looked at, participants were immersing themselves for between around 10 to up to 20 minutes in cold water, and typically right after they exercised. Some of the participants in these studies were doing a full body regime, which is obviously what a lot of people are doing at the moment. It's the fad is to dunk yourself shoulders under in an ice bath, but some people were just doing the trained area. So for example, a couple of studies, they just trained legs, and in those people, they just dunked their legs rather than the whole body. Now, one thing to note is that none of these studies used cold showers. In fact, I'm not really aware of any study that has looked at the effects of cold showers on muscle growth, but I'm going to touch on my opinion on what I think might be the effect in the take-home points at the end. All of these studies had participants dunk themselves in that water within around half an hour of them finished training. So obviously these people were closely monitored because they were taking part in a study. They would finish their training and they would either go straight into the cold tub or they would wait a few minutes and go in, but it would be within 30 minutes. In terms of the temperature of the water, most of these studies were using around 10 degrees Celsius. And to give you some context, so the month that I'm recording this is April, and 10 degrees is about the same temperature as the sea off the south coast of England. So that gives you an idea, pretty damn cold, basically. So what did they find? Well, long story short, cold water immersion either seemed to have no effect on muscle growth, or on the margins, probably had a little bit of a negative effect. So that meant that basically people who did just resistance training alone got better muscle growth than those who did resistance training followed by an ice bath, albeit by a very small margin. So we've got a few take-home points from this study, and I think one of them is quite key, and that is that if you are overly bothered about your muscle growth goals and you're really precious about every inch of muscle gain that you can get, which I think a lot of us probably should be, probably have enough evidence to say that dunking yourself in an ice bath right after you resistance train or within about 30 minutes or an hour is probably going to do more harm than good. Whether I think cold showers are bad for muscle growth, I don't think we have the evidence to say that that's going to be the case. That's because you're not fully immersed, you're probably not going in for as long as some of the people did in these studies, and therefore it's probably not going to have as meaningful of an effect on some of the adaptations that we see get disrupted with cold water immersion. Another important take-home point in this video is that we don't have any evidence to say cold showers, or even ice baths for that matter, are negative for muscle gain when we do them at other times of the day. So all of the studies included in this review used ice baths within 30 minutes of training. Now, I'd argue that most people who are into their ice baths for mental reasons rather than physical are probably not looking to do them as soon as they get in after training. You're probably doing it in the morning and then training in the evening, or maybe you're training, you're then going to have a break, have some dinner, and then you go into your ice bath. And if you're doing that, if there's a few hours at least between your training and your ice bath, I don't see it being a major problem. But ultimately, if you're the sort of person who wants to optimize everything about their muscle growth, I would say you can pretty much just get rid of ice baths, unless you see some crazy mental benefits from it, in which case you might say that the positives outweigh the negatives, but the mechanisms as to why this might not be the best thing for muscle growth make sense, and now we have a bit of research to actually back that up. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll be back next week for another video, so hit the subscribe button.